Hi, hello all, and welcome to our third Friday Forum event entitled Food Assistance, How Our Politics Shape the Way We Help. My name is Dominique Arnold, as Ann said, and I am the program coordinator for the YMCA of the University of Illinois. And I am honored to announce our two amazing speakers for this lecture. Michael Gillespie is currently an assistant professor of sociology at Eastern Illinois University. He is highly engaged in local anti-poverty work and is enthusiastically loved by his students. Currently, his research is focused on the geographic distribution of poverty and social insecurity in East Central Illinois, the gaps in access to social welfare services, and how changes to federal welfare policies such as SNAP, TAMP, National School Lunch, and Breakfast programs correlate with changes in the availability of and access to the social safety net. Andrea Rundell, our second speaker, has worked as a professional in the nonprofit sector since 1998. I've had the personal pleasure of working with her closely in her role as an executive director of the YWCA. Until recently, Andrea was director of programs at the Eastern Illinois Food Bank, managing the Backpack program, SNAP outreach, school pantries, and more. Andrea is passionate about social justice in its many forms, as is Michael, and I am excited to be present for their lecture today. With that, I'd like to turn it over to them, and let's all give them a great round of applause.
All right, we're going to tempt gravity in this clip here. All right, how's everybody doing? It's good to see so many people out in Y-tie, trays of good-looking food, so this was great. It's an honor to be here and to come on up to Champaign and be asked to do this. I'm Michael Gillespie, and I'm going to take over the first half. Andrea's going to come over and take over the second half, and then we have a little bit of time reserved for some questions about what we're going to talk about today. I'm playing the role of professorial social historian, and so if you make it through this part, Andrea's going to wake you up, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the politics around food and around food issues, policies and programs, and the broader scope across the country and in time since the Great Depression and whatnot. But I like to open with a quote from an author named Mark Winnie, who wrote a book a couple years back called Closing the Food Gap. And it really balances this idea and presents this idea that what we're really interested in this country is not so much getting rid of poverty, which access to food is one of many conditions of poverty, but we're interested in managing it by kind of picking off a petal at a time. Our nation's approach to poverty has been to manage it, not to end it, and perhaps the best examples of good poverty management practices can be found in America's anti-hunger program. So I'm going to ask you to hang on to that, because in a few minutes you're going to see how that's going to come back around. We have this ethos in our country. It's called the American Way. It's pretty much that Horatio Alger story that were so common across the country and through time, that all you got to do is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and as long as you have the skill, the determination, you have all the opportunity in the world to make something of yourself. And so from the 1930s and even before and up until this very day, personal responsibility and self-sufficiency have really defined who we are as a people in our own brains and how we interact with each other, especially around issues of poverty and around issues of food insecurity and food justice. Now, there are two types of poor people in our country. There's those who are what we call the deserving poor, and those that are the undeserving poor. The deserving poor are deserving of assistance because their poverty is by no fault of their own. Okay, their poverty might be due to something such as their age, they're elderly, or they're a child, they might be disabled, they might be widowed. Something about their personal condition renders them unable to work. The other side of the coin is the undeserving poor, meaning that they're technically, in our American ethos, undeserving of any kind of social assistance. And this is because there's this sort of idea that they're voluntarily lazy. There's this whole mythical welfare queen, which research has bore out doesn't actually exist, to the extent that we think everybody who receives some kind of social service is just cheating the system. And then there are what we generally tend to think of as dysfunctional families. So those families don't take on that traditional family picture that we have in our heads. Single mothers with children, for example, especially single African American women, young able-bodied men who are displaced from the workforce, most immigrants who haven't been naturalized also fall into this category. So together with these two levels, or two different types of poverty, there's also two types of relief. There are social insurance programs for the deserving poor, and then public assistance for the undeserving poor. And they're sort of guided by a set of three questions. The first is, who should be helped? Okay, who should we actually be providing help for in terms of access to services? And what should they be given? Okay, once we identified who should be helped, deserving versus undeserving, then what are they deserving of, or what are they undeserving of? And then finally, how should relief or charity be administered? At what level? Is it the federal government? Is it a state government? Is it a local government? Is it a private charity, a non-for-profit, and so on? Social insurance is broad and it's universal. That meaning that it's got fixed objectives. It doesn't, it cuts across social class lines. As long as you meet what defines your entitlement to that social insurance, you have absolutely no worries, in theory. And so these things include like Social Security insurance, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, Medicare, disability insurance, and they're all predicated on that you have had a job, and part of your job is your income, and part of what happens is when you get your pay stub at the end of every 2 weeks or the end of every month, some of these programs are deducted from your take-home pay, so you're actually paying into an insurance program much like you pay auto insurance. You pay for it, and then when you need it, you use it. Okay, and so Social Security, unemployment, and the type kind of demand this buy-in. The other thing about social insurance is that as you make more money, for example, you might get a few raises, you might move up in a couple of positions. As you make more money, your benefits from these social insurance programs actually also increase when you need them. So, for example, unemployment insurance, you get a percentage of your pay, and so the more you're paid, the larger amount of money that you are going to get in terms of your benefits. Now, public assistance is what we call means tested. And means tested is another idea where it's income-based qualification, but this is tied to the federal poverty guidelines. And the federal poverty guidelines have a long and strenuous and deep history, and not everybody likes them, partially for good reason, but they are tied to this idea of food and how much food actually costs. So I'm not going to go into the history of how the poverty guidelines were created, but the means test in and of itself, the income of a household or an individual, determines what kinds of programs or what kinds of relief you actually get. So TANF, which is the cash assistance program across the country, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a tax credit for low-wage workers, food assistance programs like SNAP and the school lunch programs, housing aid, WIC. These are all determined by how much money you make. It's based on your current work status, and all of these demand either that you are working at least part-time or in some kind of training program to get you back into the workforce. And the trick of this is the higher the income that you make, the lower the benefits that you get, because the assistance is to get you to a certain level of income. And so the public assistance that's actually given is assistance for you to achieve a certain level of poverty, not necessarily get you out of poverty. Now, federal food politics play a lot and a big role into how these all played out. And this slide and the next several kind of are this balance between what we do for agriculture and farms and what we do for hunger. In the Great Depression back in the 1930s and before, there was a large surplus of commodities that were produced by the agricultural base around the country, for the sole fact that people were broke and they couldn't pay money to buy food. And so someone had the idea back in the 1930s that we should get these surplus food commodities to people who are hungry, and then therefore it will take care of the stock of food, and we can help alleviate a lot of the uncomfortableness with actual real hunger that was happening. And this worked out fine for the majority of the people who actually got the surplus commodities until World War II hit, and then surpluses turned into deficits, and a lot of these food programs and the surplus commodities were scaled back because they were needed either in the war effort or there weren't the stockpile of commodities that there were during the Great Depression. And that's sort of how the status was in general until the Great Society programs of the 1960s, Johnson's War on Poverty, John F. Kennedy before him, when hunger was really rediscovered in our country. It didn't go anywhere. It was just sort of rediscovered. The country was booming in the 50s. We had just gotten out of the war. Everything was good. Our soldiers were back home, and everybody was feeling good until all of a sudden we were smacked in the face with the reality that people were still destitute and still in need of some adequate nutrition. And so this is when the federal poverty guidelines were actually created, because the government wanted to know exactly how much poverty there was around the country, so they knew how much they needed to allocate to help alleviate this. And so the anti-poverty programs that were actually created in terms of the war on poverty and some programs before that didn't really address poverty in and of itself. They addressed these conditions of poverty. And anti-poverty activists through 1964, 65, the Poor People's Campaign, even civil rights movements, took on a piece of things that come along with poverty, like educational level, health insurance, Medicare and Medicaid were created in this time, and the federal food stamp program was actually created during this time too. And so instead of focusing and targeting on big, large-scale anti-poverty efforts, each interest group had its own sort of niche market on what they wanted to do. And those people who were interested in hunger really targeted food security by looking at this conditions, not cash. We didn't want to give you handouts, as the line goes. We wanted to give you a hand up. And you needed to get several different hands up in terms of if you're looking for education or you're looking for medical assistance or you're looking for some food. The other thing that happened was there's a lot of rancor going on in the federal legislature because the people who really needed the food and needed the assistance lived in central cities. This is still during part of the later years of the Great Migration from the South, where people were moving from the South up to the North into the great manufacturing centers looking for well-paying jobs. And so a lot of the poverty was located in these central cities, but of course the agricultural system was not located in these central cities. And so there was still this idea that there needed to be this balance between food and getting food where it needed to be, and those people who actually produced the food. And so the lobbyists in Congress and then the lawmakers themselves actually formed sort of this unspoken at first, but then what really played out to be quite energetic duality where farmers would support food assistance and the farm lobby would support food assistance for those people who needed it in the inner cities, while the urban lawmakers who had absolutely no idea or concept what it goes into actually producing that food and working on the farms would support the insurance for the farmers and support crop insurance and subsidies and those sorts of things. It's an arrangement that we still have today. And again, it highlights this idea that there's those deserving and the undeserving, the deserving being the farmers who are the breadbasket, and the undeserving being the people who are impoverished in central cities. And so it's food assistance and crop insurance. It's not food insurance and crop assistance, for example. And then as time went by, this tension or this duality plays out. In the 1950s and the 60s, in the food stamp program and some of the food programs that existed, it was very limited, and there was this purchase requirement, which meant that if you needed food assistance at this time, there's actual food stamps, you had to take actual money in, buy the stamps, and you got so much more in stamps than you actually paid for. So if you got, for example, $5 worth of stamps, you might get $20, or I'm sorry, yeah, you paid $5, you got like $20 worth of stamps. So you actually get more money worth of food. But it's also a way for people who are in need to access surplus commodities, because the surplus commodities were actually cheaper than going to the grocery store and buying things like fresh meat and fresh fruit. Big jars of peanut butter and cheese and some of the dairy commodities were much cheaper. And this is the way it played out until the mid-1970s, where people weren't accessing the food stamp program because they didn't have any cash to buy the stamps. And so they got rid of the purchase requirement. They expanded the program nationwide, but the trade-off was they started to build in some kind of contingencies around work and around requirements for people to be doing something productive in order to get these benefits. In the 1980s, this whole system kind of fell apart because Ronald Reagan cut back on a lot of the social safety net when he went through his budget cuts. And it wasn't just food programs, it was cash assistance, it was a lot of the medical programs, Social Security took a hit. Everything was scaled back due to budget deficits. And this is when we actually see the rise of what I like to term sometimes as the fingers in the dike. The private charities, the non-for-profits, the food pantries, the food banks, the soup kitchens rose through the 1980s and early 1990s to address this gap, to address the actual reality that federal food assistance and state-based food assistance was waning, but people were still in much need of getting some food into their bellies, into the bellies of their children. And so through the 1980s and the 1990s, even though the federal government did spend a lot of money, much more than these private charities did, the private charities were actually used much more because they were much more easily accessible, and there was different requirements. You can go to a food pantry with a bag at a certain schedule and you can get some food versus going through and then having to go through the application process and have your life picked apart by a service worker to get your food assistance. Another one of the big things that happened as I go quickly through the history of this is what happened in 1996, which is what we call welfare reform, which President Clinton and the legislature completely overhauled how we fund and deliver federal anti-poverty programs. A quick piece here: these were put into block grants, and a block grant is essentially every state got a lump of money based on need. With some fairly loose federal parameters in terms of what the states needed to do with that money, and then it was up to the states to get rid of that money by giving it to local entities, governments, private organizations to deliver the actual services themselves. Well, the writing was on the wall for food programs, and because there's always been a strong farm lobby in our country, the farmers didn't want to be included in these block grants because they didn't want that their money could be lumped in and that state and local governments could choose how much they would get. They wanted that guarantee from the federal government that they were getting based on what their crop insurance levels are and what their subsidies were. And so the people who were then tied to the strong farm lobby, those who were looking at food assistance, said, well, if they're not going to be included, we don't want to be included either. And hence they were not included. So this is the one part of the federal social safety net that was not included in these block grants was the crop insurance and the food assistance. And to this day, they're still not block granted. They're primarily federal programs that come with their own funding streams through the USDA. And so the safety net turns into be this sort of personal responsibility workfare safety net. And looking at our food assistance programs and how we actually do this and how they're tied to other lobbies, especially the food lobby and the farm lobby, mean mean-tested public assistance is a supplement. Okay, you have to bring something to the table, and it's really designed to support an individual initiative and not dependency on any one program. So the gaps tend to be filled then by private charities, by our nonprofit programs, food banks, food pantries, soup kitchens, and the like, to fill that gap. Because if you can't find a job, you can't buy into the system. If you can't buy into the system, then you can't get your federal food assistance. And so the requirement that there's some work or some job-based training also requires that those things are actually available. And while the economy arguably has been on an uptick, it's been on an uptick for some and not for all. And a lot of these jobs and these opportunities still are proving elusive for many people who need it. STAP supplements the assets of the household. You get up to 130% of the federal poverty line based on your household composition in benefits. And if you make $1 more above this, you get no benefits. There's a whole series of complicated deductions based on your assets and how much you're allowed to have and not, and if you have one car or two, and the number of children, and so on and so forth. But as soon as you break that threshold, all of your benefits are pulled back. And then there's only a 3-month time limit if you're unemployed. And so that also poses a problem, because if you're looking for a job for 3 months and you can't find something, your benefits are scaled back as well. So there's still some big gaps here and some big issues, and especially how it ties to work and the labor force and what's actually happening with boots on the ground and in reality in places like Champaign and Urbana and in the county and in the region. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Andrea, and she's going to take over from here. All right.
First things first, I'm nowhere near as tall as Michael. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Andrea Rundell, and I am currently the executive director at the YMCA, which is just upstairs in this building, and we're happy to be doing lots of things back and forth with the YMCA because we're getting in all kinds of things and having a great time. So we're very happy to be collaborating on these. I was very excited to be asked to talk about food assistance and food justice because these are subjects near and dear to my heart, having spent the last 9 years working with the Eastern Illinois Food Bank and with food pantries and getting very deeply into hunger issues. And on that note, I'll probably say it more than once, but I want to say very clearly that these are my opinions, not the Eastern Illinois Food Bank's opinions. And I'm sure any of these issues that I'm talking about would be things that they would be more than happy to talk with you about, but don't assume they agree with me particularly. Okay, good, got that. Cool, guys? Thank you. Okay. So I'm really kind of spinning off a lot of what Michael was saying, in that when I'm talking about politics of poverty, I'm really kind of talking about American beliefs about who is affected by poverty and hunger, how they're affected by poverty and hunger, why they're affected by poverty and hunger, and what we have, what kind of responsibilities we have as communities to address them. So I'm not talking about party politics, because all of these beliefs that I'm thinking of are ones that underlie a lot of just American bootstrappiness, right? That whole Horatio Alger thing of, I can do this myself, and how do we relate to people on those grounds? So some of the ingrained beliefs about poverty that I think we have as Americans and that underlie a great deal of how we personally interact with poverty are these: that poverty is a result of laziness or a lack of work, that people who experience poverty are selfish or inconsiderate or greedy, that poverty is a result of poor choices that people have made, and that people who experience poverty are inherently untrustworthy. None of these are really happy things to say, but I think that they are things that, again, are really ingrained into American life and have a lot to do with the how we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps ideals of America. And I think they have a really big impact on how we go about implementing food assistance when we as just individuals get out there and do it. So moving on to local food assistance. Food pantries give out groceries to feed households. They're run by real people, and I do not want to suggest anything but that these are people who truly want to help. People who run food pantries do it because they really want to help. And so while I'm going to be critical of some of the decisions that get made there, I don't want to suggest that anyone is doing anything out of some sort of malice or poor feeling for anybody. People who engage in this work do it for many and various reasons. They bring a lot of different beliefs about poverty and hunger with them. And anybody who's engaged in this work, the beliefs that they bring are going to inevitably influence the way they do the work that they do. These people have a lot of decisions to make. If you've never actually been engaged in working with a pantry, you might think it's just, you get some cans of food and you give them out. And if you say that to someone who's working in a pantry, they will laugh very hard in your face because there's a lot of work that goes into this. And so all of these decisions have to be made. And so what I want to do really is talk through some of these decisions and how in some ways, if we allow beliefs that we are not reflecting on about how people are poor, why people are poor, those are going to lead us into consequences that we don't actually want. They're going to lead us to points that are going to be problematic. So, off we go. So here's another disclaimer piece. I want to tell you, I'm not interested in talking about the obvious stuff, by which I mean definite exclusions based on race and ethnicity. For instance, I have encountered or I had encountered a pantry, and by the way, I'm not naming anyone, and I'm only using examples from far away from here. Okay? A pantry that decided that for whatever reason they wanted to specifically exclude Latinos, and so they built in structures saying, well, we're going to require ID from people, and the ID that we require is actually only going to be from Latinos, and we're going to tell them that this is not appropriate ID, and then we don't have to serve them. Right? So we had a very long discussion. I had a hard time keeping my temper down on that one. But I'm not interested actually at this point in talking about sort of the major big things like that. Nor am I interested in talking about other exclusions that do happen based on religion. I have encountered, a group that explicitly required a letter of referral from a minister of a local church, any local church you like, but it had to be a minister of a local church saying not just that a person was in need, but that they were a regular member and attendee of a church. Right? Okay. Happily, those kinds of things are immediately problematic. I'm not going to go over how problematic they are. And if you are a pantry working with the Eastern Illinois Food Bank, you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble for doing these kinds of things because they're completely off the charts on that one. So I'm not talking about those kind of big, in-your-face, these are problem things. I'm also not talking about exclusions based on, oh yeah, wait, high school rivalry? What? I did, in fact, have a long conversation, at one point, with a pantry that was happy to serve anybody in their county except anyone who came from the rival high school district. I really wasn't sure whether I should burst out laughing or not at that point, but they were extremely serious about it. So nothing that odd either, okay? Those are all my disclaimers for now. All right. Pantry people have to decide a whole bunch of things. Among them, they have to decide things like when are they going to have that pantry be open, who are they going to serve, whether clients can select food for themselves, and what the conditions of getting food will be. So there are practical considerations for all of these things. There's also political considerations based on those beliefs that we have about people in poverty, why and how they're there. So I'm going to take a poke at a couple of these decisions and how not reflecting on some of the problematic beliefs that we have about poverty in America create problematic food systems when we start implementing them. So when's the pantry going to be open? Among other things you have to think about, when do we have volunteers, right? These are largely vastly volunteer-run organizations. When is the space available? You're unlikely to have your own dedicated space. You're likely to have to share it with somebody. How are you going to manage that? Who needs the help? Is it the homeless? Is it people who are unemployed? And how often do people need help? We start moving into beliefs about who needs help and why when we start thinking about who on earth are we going to be serving and how do we serve them best. So here we have Louie's Food Pantry. There is no Louie's Food Pantry in this area. That's why I chose the name. If you have a belief that mostly you are talking about serving people who are unemployed, then really short hours in the 9 to 5, Monday through Friday time span sound just fine. Right? If you're believing that hunger just isn't prevalent, that people who work don't need help, that if you have a job, this is not going to be a problem for you, then that's just fine. Unfortunately, when you set things like that and you say we're making sure we're feeding particularly people who we believe are in need, but people above this are not in need, you end up excluding people who actually need that help. So if you think about it in terms of people who have jobs don't need help, you end up saying things like, it's okay for us to try and serve people in working hours because no one's going to be trying to make it during working hours. Right? If you place that income eligibility level at 100% federal poverty level and under, or say things like, we're only going to allow people to come in once every 90 days, what you're saying is people don't really need that much food. And it's, not people who are working, not people who are in those situations who are actually doing it. We hold on to these beliefs about who needs help in the face of some pretty well-documented facts of unemployment, underemployment, and poverty-level wages. And if you picked up the handout that was sitting at the front there, you'll see on the back there's a piece from Feeding America about Champaign County specifically and food insecurity in Champaign County. And so just sort of pointing back at this, working people, in fact, do go hungry all across the United States. And here in Champaign County, we have some numbers for you. The great thing about this particular little map is it shows you just how much of the poverty and hunger that is being experienced is experienced by people who are well above the level at which they can receive assistance. So down here, 56% of the people in Champaign County are below 130% of the federal poverty level. And as Michael mentioned, that's the magic number because that's the number at which you can receive SNAP assistance. But above that number, 44% of the people left in Champaign County who experience food insecurity aren't able to do that, right? So we have people from 130 to 185% poverty who are able to get some reduced price meals for kids, that sort of thing. And then we have another 32% of people in this county who have no federal or otherwise government assistance to turn to, but have only the charitable response to turn to. And for anyone who's interested at this point, 100% of the federal poverty level right now for a family of 4 is $23,550. Making $23,550 is considered to be the level at which you can sustain a family of 4. Anything else exciting about there? No, what am I doing? Here we go. That 185% federal poverty level is actually a pretty significant number, that line right there. because 185% is statistically considered to be the level at which you can actually afford food, housing, transportation, healthcare, and childcare. Your very basic bills is 185% of the federal poverty level. So you obviously at that level are working, and you're only just able to pay your bills if you're there or below. So having that really American idea, you're working, you don't need help, right, doesn't come through when you start looking at these things. So here's another decision that Louis has to make about his food distribution. Whether he's going to package his clients' groceries up ahead of time and hand them bags, or allow them to decide what food they'll bring home to their families. And again, there are practical considerations, but there are also political beliefs about poverty that are in there as well. Ultimately, you're asking, why are people in need of food? There is an extremely useful way of going about and doing this. Oh, there we go. Some of the things that end up being more political, personal belief considerations are back to, why do people need food, and how do we relate to people who are in need of food? What's our relationship with them? It is a best practice to use something called client choice. There are a large number of ways to structure client choice. What it really means is having a food distribution system that in one way or another allows people to decide what food they get, what sort of foods they receive. You can do it based on the type of items or the number of items or pounds or whatever. You can make out, a way of going through this to give people choices within a sort of structure. Choice is considered a best practice because it dramatically reduces consumer food waste. It reduces cost to pantries, and it recognizes that household members are the ones who are best equipped to know their household diets, food allergies, and food preferences. And not incidentally, it also emphasizes respect for and trust in the client, in that it's saying to them, we trust that you can make these decisions. So why wouldn't you go with client choice? Like I said, there are practical considerations, but I'm interested in the political considerations right now. What are the beliefs that people express when they say this is not something we want to do? And you can hear people say, well, beggars can't be choosers, which kind of really only says to me, people in need just don't deserve self-determination, which I find to be a really problematic kind of thing. Just because you're someone who has needs doesn't mean that you should be suddenly bereft of any ability to make your own choices and decisions. The first few people will take everything and they'll leave nothing for others. There's a kind of a panic that sometimes people recommend bring in. And what that says to me is that there's that belief under there that people in poverty are going to be selfish and greedy. Right? Another thing that I don't think we really want to be resting everything on. You'll hear they want the bad stuff. They won't choose the good stuff. People in poverty make bad choices, is what I hear behind that. And then you hear, well, if she hadn't bought those cigarettes, this wouldn't be a problem, right? Which comes around to, as far as I read it, people are in poverty because they make bad choices, right? And so all of these are things that we have in that American ideal of, it's the individual who makes the choices, who makes their life, right? You have that ability, you can make all those things happen yourself as long as you try hard enough, as long as you have the right ideals, right? And unfortunately, I think that when we allow those to sort of overtake our thinking, we end up in a spot where we don't actually want to be when we're trying to help people. So back to Louis' food pantry. We already know he's open second Mondays of the month. We know the eligibility. He's going to go with pre-boxed. We're just going to make those decisions for the people who are coming to us because they are not in a position to make those decisions for themselves. So you end up seeing a pantry kind of like that, with a lot of bags and a lot of boxes sitting around like that. The last one that I want to have a hack at, how do we know who needs help? This is always a big, big concern for people who are running pantries. And it's one that's really fraught with a whole lot of baggage to try and figure out how do you do that. Because what it really comes down to is figuring out, things like who really is hungry, and you get back to the thing that Michael was pointing about, having people who deserve help and people who don't deserve help. And you start, if you follow that path, you start making those kinds of decisions. And I think that that's, again, very problematic. So we have ample statistical evidence that lots and lots and lots of people are hungry, right? In Champaign County, as of 2012 data, 33,460 people are food insecure. That's almost 17% of the population. And 44%, like I said earlier, are the people who live above 130% of the federal poverty level. They need charitable response. They haven't got anything else to turn to. So again, the best practice is going to be the least obtrusive practice. It's going to be ask people to affirm that they are hungry. Right? When you ask them for anything in the way of saying, what sort of bar do they have to meet, and pantries generally have to have a, we serve this income level and below, set the bar high. Right? If we're looking at this, if you're setting that bar at 100% poverty, you're cutting all the way down to here. And these are the people up here who can only be have their needs met by charitable response. So set that bar high. So the things that come through that people start talking about when they start hearing those voices that say, people in need do it to themselves, people in need, aren't going to be trustworthy, are conditions that come up like this, saying, well, there aren't that many people who are hungry, or how do we know they're not lying? And I would hear that frequently from people. How do we know they're not lying if they say that they fit under the income level? And my actual response every time was, lucky for you, you don't have to know. Right? Isn't that great? You don't have to be the police on this one. Right? All you have to do is say, can you tell me that? They tell you that, you're done. Well, what if they lie? If they lie, it's between them and their conscience. It's between them and their God. It's not your problem. Right? People are cheating the system. That's a really, 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 really tiny number. Over and over again, we've found that that's a really, really, really tiny number. Right? So I'm not sure that's the one to be really hung up about. We have to make sure we're helping the people who really need it. I understand this as a real need. I understand that, that's what you're trying to do. I understand you have limited resources. I'm also going to say, it's going to be really hard for you to figure that one out, except by asking them if they really need it. All these kinds of things end up tempting us to become the food police. This is not only bad for clients who get treated with suspicion and disdain, it's bad for us. Right? In the name of justice, we end up building mistrust and cynicism into the very work that we are doing because we are compassionate people. Right? We pull ourselves into a bind when we do it that way. Right? So here's the food pantry that I look at and I cringe and say, we just narrowed it down to very, very few people, and we aren't going to make them feel very good about themselves, and ultimately we're not going to feel good about ourselves either in doing this work. Right? And ultimately, right, if we do not fully investigate our beliefs about poverty, we turn the opportunity that we came to doing this work out of compassion into a system of misunderstanding and mistrust and blame that not only dehumanizes the people who are in need of food assistance, but ourselves as well. So my advocacy here today is think about things. Think about what sorts of things you're doing and why. And hopefully, I'm going to implore you to think about doing them in the ways that most are respectful of other people's dignity and also respectful of your own compassion. Thank you. Anne, did you want to run around with this? Okay.
I haven't turned it on. So this is the really hokey part, but since we are recording always on the Friday Forum and they are rebroadcast, it's helpful if we actually catch the questions as well as the answers. So if you have a question, put your hand up. If we have a flurry of them, I'll let these guys acknowledge, but generally if you have a question, put your hand up. I'll bring you a mic and ask your question and then give it back to me and we'll hand it to the next person. Paul, you've got your hand up.
Just as, I don't want to waste too much time because there isn't much, but there are traditional classes of social insurance people that are stigmatized now. We've gotten to a place where disability people are being attacked. Right. And there is some fraud, but I think it's the least of it. And I'd like to think of this in terms of, whether there's been any progress. In the 30s you were describing, there was rampant plague and beriberi throughout the South and maybe even in the North some places. Now we have food deserts in cities. And, is that progress? It seems like I think we have to compare to what would actually be possible in this highly advanced technological society. It's an atrocity that we have anything like that at all. But then a specific question, and it is political. Rauner said he was going to cut food stamps. Now, I was assured that he can't, because it's federal money, and he could turn it down, but that wouldn't look very good unless he's really playing to some kind of, he's either uninformed or he's playing to some of the basis kind of attitudes in the culture, it seems to me. And but there is this matching funds that's going on in the food stamp program for education and maybe facilitating food delivery in circles that may be possibly to be cut back. I don't know if that would affect the food bank but anyway, that's a little complicated, but if you could address that in any fashion, and I want to at least put it out there. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. The federal government provides a certain pool of money to the states, and the states are obliged to run their food stamp program, but states can also supplement that. And so any cutback or change in eligibility levels or things is the state's responsibility. The federal food stamp program called SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also comes with education funds, outreach funds, who's eligible based on time limits and when, and a lot of these things tend to be played around with the states. And so when our governor says that a target could be food stamps, it could be scaling back a lot of what the state does or supplement in terms of the length of time that can be spent, how much money the state gives to that. I do know that the state follows the 130% of the federal poverty level in terms of income for people who are under 60 years of age, and non-disabled. If you're disabled or you're older than 60 years of age, it's much higher. It's 200% of poverty. But then based on what you do in terms of work, if you're a student, if you're unemployed, if you're on unemployment insurance, also play into it as well. There's also a tie-in with other social welfare programs such as heating and housing assistance that generally comes with categorical eligibility, which means that if you are eligible for one program, you usually get benefits from other programs. Food assistance is one of them. And so a lot of governors actually around the country are looking at how they can tear some of those connections apart so that the categorical eligibility also can disappear. And then that also cuts the rolls in the number of people who are eligible for food stamps.
All right. First, thank you both. This was really great. And this question is probably a little bit for both of you, and maybe it's also, a pretty big topic in and of itself. But I was wondering if you could address a little bit more about farm subsidies and how that plays into, the kind of food that is produced, and maybe even the kind of food that goes to food banks eventually. So if you could address that.
I'm going to recommend highly that you watch A Place at the Table, which will be showing soon. I'll ask Ann to actually shout out the dates on that one. It's a great movie that actually addresses that specifically, among many, many other things. Food subsidies in the United States, as Michael said, are very much based on agriculture and what farmers need, and sort of secondarily about getting food to people in need as sort of a byproduct of the process. One of the things that means is that the things that get subsidized are the things that will ultimately be on people's plates. And so when we have food subsidy or agricultural subsidies towards things like corn and grains, those are going to end up making sure that we have highly processed foods on people's tables. There's kind of no getting around that because you can't eat field corn, but you can turn it into chips. So how those subsidies play out on a national level makes a really big impact on how people who are in poverty and who do need that sort of assistance are able to eat. And yeah, what it is that they actually get. And the food bank, any food bank has very little choice about what they get from those kinds of systems. Yeah.
Regarding the screening of A Place at the Table, to reiterate, it is showing Tuesday, February 24th at 7:30 p.m. at the Art Theater. It is a benefit, so they are asking for a suggested donation of $10. And I have flyers, if you're welcome to pick one up for me on your way out when you do leave.
What's the percentage of food that comes through private donations or through drives versus through the industries and those types of donations?
To food banks?
To food banks, yes.
For instance, the Eastern Illinois Food Bank, if my numbers are still about right, private donations like can drives make about 2.5% of the food that actually gets used and goes through the food bank system. Food banks are heavily dependent on manufacturers and distributors in order to be able to get food and get it out there. Thank you everybody very much for coming and listening.
Thank you so much.